All right, so today we're going to tackle something pretty heavy but really fascinating, I think.
Mm.
We're going to take a deep dive into sin,
Oh, yeah.
the nature of sin.
Mm.
And we're going to be looking at this text called The Nature of Sin.
Okay.
So I don't know about you, but like when I was a kid, I thought sin was like breaking the rules,
Right.
like
Right.
sneaking a cookie before dinner,
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
But this text is suggesting there's like way more to it than just breaking the rules.
It definitely goes deeper than that.
Yeah.
The text actually defines sin as disobedience to God.
Okay.
And it kind of breaks it down into 3 key categories to help us understand this whole thing a little bit better.
Okay.
We've got personal sin,
Mm-hmm.
the sin nature,
Okay.
and imputed sin.
3 categories.
3 categories.
Okay. All right, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
Let's start with those personal sins then.
Sure.
The text uses this analogy of falling short, and it really kind of made me think. It talks about 2 people trying to jump across a 16-foot wide river.
Okay.
One jumps 5 feet, the other one jumps 15 feet. They both fall short.
Right.
But does that mean that even like trying to be good isn't enough?
That's a great question. And I think the text seems to suggest that even when we try our best, we inevitably miss the mark.
Mm.
And it goes on to say that it's not just about our actions either,
Okay.
but it's about our attitudes and intentions as well.
So even those thoughts that we try to brush off
Yeah.
can be considered sin.
Yeah.
I remember reading that Jesus himself said lusting is a form of adultery and anger can be akin to murder.
Wow.
That always seemed pretty intense to me.
It definitely challenges us to examine our inner world.
Yeah.
And the text really makes it clear that sin isn't just some kind of abstract concept,
Right.
It gives examples.
Yeah.
Like speeding,
Okay.
which would be a sin of commission,
Okay.
where we actively choose to do wrong. Or something like forgetting to renew your driver's license. That's a sin of omission.
Oh.
Failing to do what's required.
So it's like woven into the fabric of our everyday lives?
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're constantly falling short and sinning in these different ways, like what are the consequences?
Mm-hmm.
What happens because of those personal sins?
Well, the text doesn't shy away from the consequences.
Yeah.
It states pretty clearly that personal sin leads to a broken fellowship with God.
That makes sense. Sin creates distance between us and God.
Mm-hmm.
But the text also mentions a remedy, right?
Yes, absolutely. Even though the consequences of sin are serious,
Right.
we are not left without hope.
Okay.
The text emphasizes that confession and asking for forgiveness can restore that broken fellowship with God.
Okay. That's reassuring to hear. All right. So on to the next category, the sin nature. This one kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
The idea that we're born with this predisposition to sin.
Right.
It's like this inherent flaw that we inherit.
Yeah. The text is quite blunt about it, actually.
Yeah.
It uses phrases like conceived in sin
Wow.
and by nature children of wrath.
Yeah.
It's not really sugarcoating it.
No, those are some strong words. So how does this sin nature, this inborn glitch, actually affect us day to day?
Well, it impacts us on multiple levels.
Okay.
One example the text gives is how the sin nature clouds our ability to grasp spiritual truths.
I've experienced that. Sometimes even the most basic concepts of faith
Yeah.
can feel confusing or distant. Like there's this barrier I can't quite get past.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that could very well be the sin nature at work, creating that barrier between us and God.
Wow, that's pretty profound. It's not just about like making bad choices, like this underlying condition
Right.
affecting our understanding.
Exactly.
What about our conscience?
Hmm.
That inner voice telling us right from wrong.
Right.
Does the sin nature mess with that too?
Absolutely. The text says the sin nature can actually desensitize our conscience to the point where it's no longer a reliable guide.
Oh.
Yeah, it's like that inner voice
Right.
goes silent just when we need it most.
And then there's our will.
Yeah.
Even when we know what's right,
Mm-hmm.
it can feel impossible to actually choose it.
I know. That's the frustrating part, isn't it?
It is.
The text highlights this struggle, suggesting that even when confronted with the truth,
Right.
the sin nature can make us resistant to choosing good.
Wow.
And the key takeaway here, and it's a tough one,
Yeah.
is that we sin because we are sinners.
Hmm.
It's not just about what we do, but who we are at our core.
Okay, so if our very nature is flawed, how can we ever hope to overcome sin?
Right.
This is starting to feel a bit overwhelming.
I understand, but it's important to remember that there's hope.
Okay.
The text doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture of human nature.
Right.
It points us toward a solution.
Okay.
And we'll get to that.
I'm definitely ready to hear about that solution.
Yeah.
But first, we need to tackle that last category of sin, right?
Yeah.
Imputed sin.
Imputed sin. This one sounds complicated.
It is a complex concept.
Yeah.
But the text uses a really helpful analogy.
Okay.
A credit card.
Okay.
Imagine charges being added to your account,
Right.
even though you didn't swipe the card.
Okay.
That's essentially what happens with imputed sin.
Yeah.
Adam's sin in the Garden of Eden gets charged to all of humanity.
Hold on. So we're being held responsible for something Adam did thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem fair at all.
I hear ya. It's a natural reaction. And it's something the text addresses directly. It argues that it's not just about that one act of disobedience.
Okay.
Adam's sin triggered a chain reaction,
Yeah.
corrupting our very nature
Right.
and incurring a penalty.
And that is death. Death. So we're talking like physical death here. Like
Yeah.
everyone eventually dies.
Yes, physical death is a part of it.
Mm-hmm. It's a universal experience that brings the abstract concept of sin
Yeah.
into sharp focus. But the text also implies that there might be more to death than just the physical aspect.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. If Adam's sin is charged to us, leading to death, is there any way out of this predicament?
Well, here's where the hope comes in.
Okay.
The text introduces the flip side of imputation,
Okay.
Christ's righteousness, being credited to us.
So it's like having our account wiped clean.
It's like having our account wiped clean, a fresh start.
So while the consequences of sin are serious, we're not left without hope.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. We've got these three types of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Personal, the sin nature,
Right.
and imputed sin.
Yes.
And it sounds like understanding these distinctions can really change how we view ourselves and our actions.
Absolutely. It invites us to look deeper beyond just the surface level of our behavior.
Yeah.
And it raises a really important question. If sin is disobedience to God, and God calls us to holiness,
Mm-hmm.
what areas of our lives might need a closer look?
Yeah, that's a question I think we all need to kind of wrestle with.
Yeah.
But it feels like this deep dive has already given us, like, serious food for thought.
It has.
Before we started, I had this image of sin as, like, this monstrous thing
Right.
lurking in the shadows. But this text paints a much more nuanced picture.
Yeah,
It's both challenging and hopeful.
it is. I think that's a great observation.
Yeah.
It's not about being paralyzed by fear, but about recognizing the reality of sin and its impact on our lives.
Right.
And ultimately understanding the solution that's offered through Christ.
You're right. It's that contrast. The darkness of sin making the light of grace shine even brighter.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, the text also dives into some specific examples
Yes.
of those personal sins. And some of them were honestly surprising to me.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just the big sins I expected.
I know that's one of the things that struck me as well.
Yeah.
The text highlights how sin can show up in really subtle ways, you know? Okay.
It's not just about those dramatic transgressions,
Yeah.
but those seemingly small choices
Yeah.
that we make every single day.
Like what kind of things?
Well, for example, the text mentions evil thoughts as a form of personal sin.
Evil thoughts.
Yeah. And I think we've all had those random, sometimes even disturbing
Right.
thoughts pop into our heads.
Yeah. Are we really supposed to like control every single thought?
That's a good question. I don't think it's necessarily about eradicating every negative thought, you know.
Sure.
Instead, the text seems to emphasize recognizing the patterns in our thinking.
Okay.
Are we dwelling on thoughts that are contrary to God's will?
Right.
So it's more about cultivating a mindset
Okay.
that aligns with our desire for holiness.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It's about the direction of our thoughts, what we choose to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
What about that concept of lusting being considered a form of adultery?
Oh, yeah.
That's always seemed extreme to me.
It might seem that way at first, but if we consider what Jesus was getting at,
It starts to make more sense. He was emphasizing the importance of guarding our hearts and minds.
okay,
Lust isn't just a fleeting thought.
right?
It's a desire that can consume us
Yeah.
and lead to actions that harm ourselves and others.
So it's about recognizing those desires and making a conscious choice to turn away from them, right?
Precisely.
It's like stopping those thoughts before they can lead to sinful actions.
Exactly. And it's not just our thoughts.
Okay.
The text also talks about how sin can manifest in our words.
Right.
Gossip, slander, lying.
Mm-hmm.
These are all examples of using our words to tear others down instead of building them up.
I think we've all been on both sides of that, haven't we?
Probably.
Both hurt by someone's words and guilty of saying things we regret later.
Yeah,
It's a good reminder of the power our words have.
it is.
But the text also mentions trespassing,
Uh-huh.
which seem a bit out of place to me in this context.
It did seem a bit random at first, but then I started thinking about it metaphorically. Trespassing is about crossing boundaries,
Yeah.
violating someone else's property.
Right.
And in a spiritual sense, maybe sin is like trespassing on God's boundaries,
Mm.
violating his will for our lives.
That's a really insightful way to look at it.
I think so.
It makes sin less about breaking arbitrary rules
Yeah.
and more about that relationship with God.
Exactly. It highlights that sin isn't just a personal matter.
Right.
It has ripple effects.
Yeah.
It impacts our relationship with God.
Right.
And with the people around us.
Speaking of relationships, the text also talks about how sin damages our fellowship with God.
Right.
It's like driving a wedge between us and him.
Yeah, it creates that separation.
Yeah.
Which often leads to feelings of isolation, emptiness, even despair.
So if that distance grows, is there any way to bridge that gap?
Well, the good news is there's always a path back to reconciliation.
Okay.
The text emphasizes confession and repentance, acknowledging our sin, asking God for forgiveness, and making a conscious effort to turn away from those behaviors.
So it's not about wallowing in guilt or shame,
Yeah,
but about taking ownership and choosing to move forward.
exactly. It's about growth transformation
Mm-hmm.
and drawing closer to God. And the text makes it clear that this process isn't a one-time thing.
Right.
It's ongoing.
Yeah.
We're all going to stumble and fall.
Yeah.
But the key is to get back up, dust ourselves off, and keep striving toward holiness.
It's not about achieving perfection, but continually moving in the right direction.
Exactly.
I like that. But I'm also curious that text mentions physical death as a consequence of sin.
Yes.
But are there other implications we need to be aware of?
Mm-hmm.
What else happens because of sin?
That's a great question, and it's something that has been debated by theologians for centuries.
Wow.
While the text focuses mainly on the spiritual consequences of sin,
Okay.
like that separation from God,
Right.
it does hint at the broader impact sin has on the world around us.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. If sin is, at its core, a rebellion against God's design for creation,
Okay.
then it stands to reason that it would have far-reaching consequences.
Right.
We see brokenness and suffering everywhere we look.
Yeah.
Relationships fall apart. Injustice prevails. Creation itself groans under the weight of sin.
I never thought about it that way, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
Sin doesn't just impact individuals.
Right.
It affects the whole world.
It disrupts the harmony that God intended for his creation. But even amidst all that brokenness,
Yeah.
the text offers us a glimmer of hope.
You're talking about the imputation of Christ's righteousness,
That's right.
right? That idea of being made right with God through Christ's sacrifice.
Exactly. Even though sin has cast a long shadow over humanity,
Right.
God's grace and mercy offer us a way out.
Yeah.
It's like a lifeline in a stormy sea.
It's amazing to think that even though we're born with this sin nature,
I know.
we're not stuck with it.
We're not.
We can choose a different path.
We can, and that choice is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It's not about earning our way to heaven,
Right.
but about accepting the free gift of salvation
Right.
offered through Christ.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
We explored the 3 types of sin,
Mhm.
looked at specific examples,
Yeah.
and talked about the consequences and the remedy.
We did.
But how do we actually apply all of this to our everyday lives?
Right.
It can feel overwhelming to even know where to begin.
I think that's a struggle we all face.
Yeah.
But the text does offer some practical advice.
Okay.
For example, it talks about the importance of guarding our hearts and minds.
So being mindful of the thoughts, we entertain the things we choose to focus on.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's about recognizing those patterns in our thinking that pull us away from God
Mm-hmm.
and choosing to turn towards him instead.
That requires real self-awareness, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. It's about being honest with ourselves about our weaknesses, the areas where we're tempted to sin, and it's about seeking God's help and overcoming those struggles.
The text also mentions using our words for good instead of harm.
Yes.
I know we touched on this earlier, but I'm curious, how do we put that into practice?
Yeah.
It's so easy to slip up and say something hurtful, especially in the heat of the moment.
You're right. It's a constant battle.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
Being mindful of the power our words have, both to build up and to tear down.
Right.
It's about choosing to speak truth in love,
Mm-hmm.
to use our words to encourage, comfort, and inspire.
That makes sense. And it applies not just to what we say out loud,
Right.
but also to how we communicate online, right?
Absolutely.
It's so easy to forget that our words have weight, even in a digital space.
They do. And in today's world where so much of our communication happens online,
Right.
it's more important than ever to be mindful of the words we choose.
So it's about being intentional with our communication,
Yes.
both online and offline, and striving to make our words a reflection of God's love and grace.
Well said. And the text also talks about the importance of respecting boundaries, both our own and those of others.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. So much of sin involves crossing boundaries,
Right.
whether it's in our relationships, our finances, or our use of time and resources.
So it's about living within the parameters God has set for us and respecting the limits he's placed on our behavior.
Yeah.
It's about living with integrity and self-control.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that our actions have consequences,
Yeah.
not just for ourselves, but for the people around us.
Right.
And it's about choosing to live in a way that honors God and shows respect for others.
I'm realizing that dealing with sin is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It's not something we can just check off our to-do list and be done with.
It's not.
It's about constantly evaluating our choices and striving to do better.
You hit the nail on the head. It's a lifelong journey of growth and transformation. But thankfully, we don't have to go it alone.
Right.
We have God's grace and mercy to guide us. And we have the support of other believers to encourage us along the way.
That's reassuring. It's easy to get discouraged when we focus on our own shortcomings.
It is.
But knowing that we're not in this alone
Right.
makes a huge difference.
It does. And the text reminds us that even though we'll stumble and fall, God is always there to pick us up and help us get back on track.
It's about recognizing our need for God's help and relying on his strength to overcome our weaknesses. That brings me back to the concept of falling short that we talked about earlier.
Right.
It's a powerful reminder that even when we're trying our best, we're still going to miss the mark.
It is a humbling realization, isn't it?
It is.
It challenges our pride and forces us to acknowledge our dependence on God.
But it also opens us up to his grace.
It does.
It reminds us that we need his forgiveness and his help to truly live a life that is pleasing to him.
You're absolutely right. It's not about striving for perfection in our own strength, but about pursuing holiness with humility and a deep dependence on God.
It's about that ongoing transformation, that daily surrender, and trusting that God is at work in us even when we can't see it.
Beautifully said. It's a journey that is both challenging and rewarding.
Yeah.
One that leads us closer to God.
Right.
And helps us become more like Christ.
I really appreciate you walking us through all of this. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up this section on personal sin, is there one key takeaway you hope our listener walks away with? What's the most important thing to remember about this aspect of sin? I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that even though we're all bound to make mistakes, we're not defined by them. We have the power to choose a different path.
Yes.
To turn away from sin and towards God.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to the core message of the text.
Okay.
That sin at its heart is disobedience to God.
It really raises the stakes, doesn't it?
It does.
It's not just about breaking arbitrary rules, but about aligning ourselves with or against the source of all goodness.
Exactly. And the text doesn't stop there. It goes on to say that God calls us to something higher. To holiness.
Holiness.
It's not simply about avoiding bad stuff, but about actively pursuing a life that reflects God's character.
That sounds like a pretty tall order, especially considering we've already established that we're all born with this sin nature.
Right.
And we're carrying the weight of Adam's sin.
Right.
Where do we even begin to pursue holiness with all that baggage?
Well, that's where the power of the Holy Spirit comes in.
Okay.
The text reminds us that we're not left to fight this battle alone.
Yeah.
We can tap into a power greater than ourselves.
So it's about surrendering to God and allowing him to work in us.
You got it. And while it is a surrender, it's not a defeat. It's about recognizing our own limitations.
Right.
And embracing the transformative power of God's grace.
I love that, but practically speaking. How do we do that? How do we actually yield ourselves to God, as the text says?
Well, the text gives some specific advice. It talks about not yielding our members,
Members.
meaning our bodies and actions,
Okay.
to sin.
So being careful about what we watch,
Yeah.
what we listen to, the company we keep.
Right.
Those things can either feed our sin nature or starve it.
You're picking up what the text is putting down, and
Yeah.
it's not just about avoiding the negative stuff.
Right.
It's about actively filling our lives with things that nourish our spirits.
Okay.
Spending time in prayer.
Yeah.
Studying scripture, surrounding ourselves with people who encourage us in our faith.
It's like building up a resistance to temptation. The more we focus on God, the less appealing sin becomes.
That's a great analogy, but the text is honest. It acknowledges that this is a battle.
Yeah.
There's this powerful line. It says, "Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead."
Wow.
It's like we've been given this new life, this fresh start,
Right.
and we have to choose who we're going to serve.
Sin or God.
Sin or God, exactly.
And that choice plays out in those daily decisions, those seemingly insignificant moments.
Exactly. It's not always about some grand gesture,
Right.
but about making the right choice in those little moments over and over again.
And we don't have to do it perfectly.
We don't have to do it perfectly. God's grace covers us even in our failures.
That's so encouraging. So this deep dive into sin has actually led us to a deeper understanding of grace, hasn't it?
It has. Without recognizing our need for grace, we can't fully appreciate its power.
Yeah.
It's like those stars, they shine brightest against the backdrop of a dark night sky.
I love that image. So as we wrap up, is there a final thought, something you'd like to leave our listener with to ponder?
Well, the text ends with a powerful call from God.
Okay.
"Be ye holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy."
It might sound daunting, this call to holiness.
It might, but remember, it's not about achieving perfection. It's about becoming more like Christ.
It's about that ongoing transformation,
Yeah.
that daily surrender, and trusting that God is working in us even when we can't see it.
Yeah, that's it perfectly.
Yeah.
So, dear listener, as you go about your day, ask yourself,
Yeah.
what does it look like for me to pursue holiness in my own life?
Mm.
Where do I need to realign my choices with God's will? It's going to look different for each of us.
And remember, you're not alone in this journey. We all stumble, we all fall short,
We do.
but we have God's grace to guide us
Yes.
and the support of other believers to encourage us along the way.
That's a beautiful reminder. And on that hopeful note, I think it's time to conclude this deep dive into the nature of sin.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into a new and fascinating